There's a kind of pressure that doesn't show up on your skin, doesn't leave marks anyone else can see, but it follows you into quiet moments, sits beside you when you wake up, lingers when everything else goes silent. It's not just about numbers, not just about what's owed or what's missing. It's something heavier, something that settles into your thoughts and slowly begins to shape how you see yourself. You might tell yourself it's temporary, just a phase, just a situation that needs time to resolve. But deep down, there's that subtle tension, the one that makes simple decisions feel loaded, that turns ordinary choices into something bigger than they should be. And before long, it's no longer just about money. It becomes about control, about freedom, about whether you're actually moving forward or just trying to stay afloat. What's strange is how quietly it all begins. Not with a dramatic fall, not with a single moment that changes everything, but with small decisions that barely register at the time. A choice here, a justification there. It all feels manageable, until one day it isn't. And when that moment comes, it rarely feels sudden. It feels like something that's been building for a long time, something that was always heading in this direction. And that's where it gets uncomfortable, because it forces a question most people avoid. What if this isn't just about circumstances? What if the situation isn't random, and the pattern isn't accidental? There's a tendency to look outward when things tighten, to blame the timing, the economy, the unexpected expenses. And sometimes those things are real. They matter. But even within those realities, yet there's something deeper moving underneath, something quieter, more subtle, shaping responses, influencing reactions, guiding decisions without ever asking permission. It shows up in the rush to solve discomfort quickly, in the need to feel relief now rather than stability later, in the quiet voice that says, just this once, even when a part of you already knows how the story tends to unfold. And the more that voice is followed, the more familiar the pattern becomes. Not because it's right, but because it's known. There's a strange comfort in repetition, even when that repetition leads somewhere you don't want to go. Because breaking a pattern means stepping into uncertainty. It means choosing something unfamiliar, something that doesn't offer immediate reassurance. And that's where most people hesitate. It's because the trap isn't just financial. It's psychological. It's emotional. And in a deeper sense, it's spiritual. It's the space where desire starts to override discernment, where impulse begins to feel like necessity, where short-term relief starts to look like a solution, even when it quietly builds long-term weight. And this is where ancient wisdom becomes unexpectedly relevant, not as abstract philosophy, not as distant ideas disconnected from reality, but as something precise, something that speaks directly into patterns like these. There's a kind of wisdom that doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply observes, over time, how human behavior unfolds, how choices compound, how small shifts create entirely different outcomes. And when you begin to look at things through that lens, something changes. Because it's no longer just about escaping a problem. It's about understanding the structure behind it. Why certain cycles repeat. Why certain decisions feel almost automatic. Why breaking free feels harder than it should, even when the path forward seems obvious. There's a line of thinking that runs quietly beneath everything. A set of internal assumptions about money, about worth, about what's deserved and what isn't. And most of the time, those assumptions aren't consciously chosen. They're absorbed, repeated, reinforced over time. They become the script running in the background. And the danger is, you can follow that script for years without ever questioning it, without ever noticing that it's leading somewhere specific, somewhere predictable, somewhere that looks a lot like where you are right now. And this is where awareness starts to shift things. Not instantly, not dramatically, but subtly. Because once you begin to see the pattern, it becomes harder to ignore. You start noticing the moments where decisions are made too quickly, the justifications that feel convincing in the moment but don't hold up later, the tension between what you want now and what you actually want long term. And that tension, that's where everything begins to change. Because for the first time, there's space. Space between impulse and action. Space between reaction and response. And in that space, something new becomes possible. But it doesn't feel comfortable. It feels slow. It feels uncertain. It feels like you're going against something deeply ingrained. And in many ways, you are. Because breaking a cycle isn't just about doing something different once. It's about consistently choosing a different path, even when the old one feels easier, even when the old one feels familiar, even when the old one promises immediate relief. And that's where discipline enters the picture, not as restriction, but as alignment, not as punishment, but as direction. Because there's a difference between reacting to life and intentionally shaping it. And most people never fully experience that difference. They move from one situation to another, responding, adjusting, coping, but never stepping back far enough to see the pattern as a whole. Never pausing long enough to ask whether the direction itself needs to change. And yet, that's where real freedom begins. Not when everything is paid off, and not when circumstances are perfect, but when the internal pattern shifts, when decisions are no longer driven by urgency, but by clarity, when actions are no longer reactions, but choices. And that kind of shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Until one day something feels different. The same situations arise, but the response isn't the same. The same opportunities appear, but the decisions carry a different weight. And that's when you realize the chains weren't just external, they were internal. And once that becomes clear, the process of breaking them truly begins. There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, where a decision is about to be made, and most people don't even realize it's happening. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no warning sign, no alarm going off. It feels ordinary, just another choice in the middle of the day. But if you slow it down, if you really pay attention, you start to notice something strange. The decision isn't coming from clarity. It's coming from discomfort, a slight tension, a need to resolve something quickly, a quiet urge to fix how you feel right now. And in that moment, the mind begins to search, not for what's right, but for what brings immediate relief. And that's where the pattern tightens. Because relief and resolution are not the same thing. Relief feels good in the moment. It softens the pressure, quiets the noise. It gives you the illusion that something has been handled. But resolution asks for something deeper. It asks for patience, for restraint, for a willingness to sit in discomfort without rushing to escape it. And most people were never taught how to do that. So they move quickly. They decide quickly. They justify quickly. And every time that happens, the pattern becomes a little more reinforced. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack desire to improve, but because the decision is being driven by something deeper than logic. It's being driven by habit. And habit, when left unexamined, becomes a kind of quiet authority. It tells you what feels normal. It tells you what feels acceptable. It tells you what feels justified, even when it's leading you somewhere you don't want to go. This is where things begin to shift, not externally, but internally. Because once you start noticing that moment, that small gap between discomfort and decision, you begin to see how often it happens. How often choices are made not from intention, but from reaction. And that awareness starts to disrupt the automatic flow. At first, it's almost frustrating. You catch yourself mid-decision. You notice the impulse. You feel the pull. And for a second, you hesitate. That hesitation, it feels unnatural, because you're interrupting something that used to run without resistance. And in that interruption, there's a question that begins to form. Why am I about to do this again? Not in a judgmental way, not in a way that creates guilt, but in a way that creates clarity. And clarity has a strange effect. And it doesn't immediately solve the problem, but it makes it impossible to ignore. You start to see connections between emotional states and financial choices, between stress and spending, between uncertainty and the need to feel in control, even if that control is temporary. And slowly, a deeper understanding begins to take shape. This isn't random. This is patterned. And once you see a pattern, you start to realize something else. Patterns can be changed, but not by force, not by sudden bursts of motivation, not by promising yourself that this time will be different. They change through something quieter, through consistency, through small, repeated decisions that go against the old rhythm. And that's where the ancient wisdom begins to feel less like theory and more like instruction. Because there's a kind of guidance that doesn't focus on dramatic change, but on steady direction, on choosing restraint when impulse feels stronger, on valuing foresight over immediacy, on recognizing that what feels urgent often isn't, and what truly matters rarely demands immediate action. There's a phrase that echoes through that kind of wisdom, not loudly, but persistently. A reminder that the wise don't rush, that they observe, that they consider, that they weigh the outcome before stepping forward. And in a world that constantly pushes for speed, for quick decisions, for instant gratification, that kind of approach feels almost unnatural. But that's exactly why it works. Because it breaks the rhythm. It interrupts the cycle. It creates distance between impulse and action. And in that distance, something powerful begins to grow. Discernment. The ability to see beyond the moment. To recognize that not every opportunity needs to be taken. That not every desire needs to be fulfilled immediately. That not every discomfort needs to be escaped. And the more that discernment is practiced, the more it reshapes behavior. At first, the changes are small, almost unnoticeable. A decision delayed, an impulse resisted, a choice reconsidered. But those small shifts, they begin to compound. Because every time you choose differently, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen a new one. And over time, something begins to stabilize. The emotional urgency starts to lose its grip. The need for immediate relief becomes less dominant. And decisions start to feel calmer, more intentional, and more aligned with something beyond the present moment. And this is where the real transformation begins to take root. Not in what you have, but in how you choose. Because once your decisions change, your direction changes. And once your direction changes, your outcomes inevitably follow. But there's a point in this process where things get tested, where the old patterns don't disappear quietly. They return, stronger, more persuasive. They remind you of how easy it used to be to just go along with them. They try to convince you that resisting isn't worth it, that a small exception won't matter, that you've earned it. And this is where most people slip back. Not because they don't understand, but because they underestimate how persistent those patterns are. They expect change to feel smooth. Oh, but real change feels like resistance. It feels like friction. It feels like going against something that has been reinforced for a long time. And yet, that resistance is a sign. Not that you're doing something wrong, but that you're doing something different. And different is exactly what breaks the cycle. So you stay with it. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but consistently. You begin to trust the slower path. The one that doesn't promise immediate relief, but builds something stronger over time. You begin to see value in patience, in restraint, in decisions that don't feel rewarding right now, but align with where you actually want to go. And slowly, almost quietly, something begins to shift in a deeper way. The sense of pressure starts to lift. Well, it's not because everything has changed externally, but because internally, you're no longer reacting the same way. And that's when you realize freedom doesn't begin when the numbers change. It begins when the pattern does. And then there comes a point where something inside you no longer negotiates. Not out of force, not out of pressure, but out of clarity that has settled so deeply, it doesn't need to argue anymore. It's quiet, steady, almost unshakable. You start to notice that the same triggers that once pulled you in don't carry the same weight. The urgency feels distant. The impulse still appears, but it no longer commands. It suggests, and you observe. And that shift, it's subtle, but it changes everything. Because now, you're no longer inside the pattern. You're looking at it. You can see how it forms, how it tries to repeat, how it waits for the right emotional moment to pull you back. But something has changed in the way you respond. There's space now, not forced, natural. And in that space, yet your decisions begin to carry a different kind of strength. Not loud strength, not dramatic discipline, but quiet consistency. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything, because it's already rooted in something deeper than temporary feeling. You begin to trust your own restraint, not as limitation, but as protection, not as sacrifice, but as direction. And over time, something else starts to emerge, something that wasn't there before. Peace. Not the kind that comes from having everything resolved, but the kind that comes from no longer being controlled by what once dominated you. You realize that the real weight was never just financial. It was internal. It was the constant pull between knowing and doing, between intention and action, between what you wanted long-term and what you kept choosing in the moment. And now, that tension begins to dissolve, because your choices are no longer divided. They're aligned. And alignment has a quiet power to it. It simplifies things. It removes the noise. It makes decisions clearer, not easier, but cleaner. You no longer need to convince yourself. You no longer need to justify. You just choose, based on where you're going, not how you feel right now. And that's where the chains begin to fall. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. One decision at a time. One moment of awareness at a time. One act of discipline that no one sees, but that changes everything. And something else becomes clear in that process. This was never about restriction. It was about restoration. restoring control where there was reaction, restoring clarity where there was confusion, or restoring direction where there was drift, and the wisdom that once felt distant, abstract, almost irrelevant, now feels precise, practical, alive, because you're not just hearing it anymore. You're living it. You begin to recognize that true wealth was never just about accumulation. It was about stewardship, about how you manage what flows through your hands, your time, your attention, your decisions. And once that understanding settles in, something shifts in the way you relate to everything. Money stops being emotional. It becomes intentional. Choices stop being reactive. They become aligned. And slowly, the external world begins to reflect what has already changed internally. The pressure reduces. The margin increases. Opportunities appear differently, not as escapes, but as extensions of a new direction. And the most surprising part is how natural it begins to feel. What once felt difficult now feels obvious. What once felt like sacrifice now feels like clarity. What once felt like limitation now feels like freedom. And that's when you realize you didn't just escape a cycle. You outgrew it. Because the version of you that was trapped in that pattern no longer exists in the same way. Not erased, but transformed. More aware, more intentional, more grounded in something that doesn't shift with every passing moment. And from that place, you move differently. You see differently. You choose differently. Not because you have to, but because you can't unknow what you now understand. And once that understanding becomes part of you, the chains don't come back, because there's nothing left inside you for them to hold on to.